Irish whiskey has three defining characteristics. It's pot stilled, it's the use of malted and unmalted barley in the mash bill, and it's triple distilled. Now, what does that all mean? And for those of you who don't indulge, or for those who've never stopped to ask the story behind a glass, I'll give a kind of brief overview. So, whiskey itself is just a spirit made from grains. And we know that the Irish were the first to start doing this. It's documented from a monastery in Ireland called Clonmacnoise in 1405 that a local clan chieftain succumbed to a surfeit, or a rather large imbibing, of Ishkaba. Now, Ishkaba is where we get the English word whiskey, but in Irish it means the water of life. And that's a fairly common term throughout European distillers, especially at that time. In France you have eau de vie, in the Netherlands you have aquavitae. Now, the practice is alive and well in the early 15th century. And over the next several hundred years, a lot of cultural impacts shape the production, taste, and style of whiskey that eventually becomes Irish whiskey. So, first off, why a pot still? Now, a pot still is the earliest type of still. And it popped up all throughout the world about 3,000 years ago. And it's essentially a rather large pot above a heat source that has a fermented beverage inside of it and a conical top. And as it's heated, alcohol vapors rise through the conical top into a worm or condensing line that captures those vapors and allows them to cool into a liquid that becomes a spirit. And there's improvements upon the pot still over the first 2,700 years, but there's no genuine innovation in distillation until the 1830s. Now, why triple distillation? As I had mentioned, there was really no massive change in the industry of distillation until the 1830s. So there's almost 400 years of the use of a pot still. And each time you distill something, you remove some elements. And people with chemical backgrounds will know this a lot better than I do, but what you end up with is something that's stripped down and lighter in mouthfeel or body. But with three distillations, you still have a very strong foundation. So Irish whiskey, after being triple distilled and having malted and unmalted barley in the mash bill, is something that can become incredibly nuanced. It has delicate light flavors, something as light as hay or apples, or something as rich as roasted hazelnuts or chocolate. And Irish whiskey has that flexibility and that nuance and that spectrum. Now, what happens in the 1830s? In the 1830s, a patent is issued for the continuous still. And this drastically increases the efficiency of distillation, the amount of output. You don't have to clean the pot each time. You can continuously run this still, almost 24/7. And it's developed by an Irishman. Now that Irishman, Anus Coffey, is met with complete dismissal. He's not only challenging an established tradition, a 4-century-old tradition in Ireland, he had also been a tax collector. So the established industry of Irish whiskey really dismissed him and stuck to their tradition. And instead, he went elsewhere with his still, to a small neighboring island that didn't really produce whiskey on any commercial scale at that point. I think it's called Scotland. Now, by 1830, though, you have 93 operating Irish distilleries. Now, it's gone from a practice in the early 15th century to a booming industry 4 centuries later. And one of the underlying contributors to this is the expansion of the English Empire. By this time, they controlled 25% of the global marketplace, and they brought Irish whiskey with them. Not only was Irish whiskey, the first whiskey that was introduced to the world. It was the premier whiskey. And all throughout the 19th century, as the Scotch start developing on an industrial level whiskey, the Irish maintain a dominance and a boutique product. However, it's at the start of the 20th century that multiple factors outside the scope and control of Irish whiskey producers really devastate the industry. Now, in 1913, you have the passing of Prohibition in America. It's not being enforced, but the foreshadow's there. 1916, you have the Easter Rebellion. Quickly after that, you have a new Irish Republic that imposes an economic war, the response of which is losing access to the English marketplace. Just devastates the Irish whiskey distilleries. But they still have America until 1919 and the passing of the Volstead Act, which allows for the enforcement of prohibition here in America. And they lose the American market. Simultaneously, you have World War I, then a Great Depression, then World War II. So in that 35, 40-year span, you go from dozens of distilleries to pretty much just 3 that are left in the wake, and they are struggling to survive. So much so that these 3 chief competitors by the 1960s come together and form a new distillery. Now those 3 distilleries are Jameson's, Powers, and the Cork Distillers. And they form the Irish Distillers, which is now commonly referred to as Middleton. And they move all their distilleries to Cork. Now that distillery keeps a 4-century-old, almost 5-century-old practice alive, keeps that spark still going. But then starting in 1990, for the past 31 consecutive years, Irish whiskey has been the fastest growing whiskey sector in the world. And that's genuinely astounding. I mean, I'm no economist, I'm a bartender, but that blows me away. And over that time period, you have, 16 new distilleries operating now, and you have people who are simultaneously maintaining a rich and beautiful tradition while really pushing the envelope, while really pushing for innovation. Whether it's the same distillery in Middleton putting out the Dargalic series that is aging things in Irish oak for the first time in well over 100 years, and they had to work with the Irish Forestry Service to do so. Whether it's Waterford being hyper-focused on where they source their barley from and really trying to develop a of the land mentality for whiskey and making sure that what you're sourcing is really, really important. And they're producing incredibly unique things. And it's beautiful to watch any expression, whether it's literary, whether it's art, whether it's distilling, be both incredibly new and traditional and reflective of that culture at the same time. And it's in doing this that I've realized that spirits aren't a homonym. They're a synonym. They're unspoilable. They change with the time and the needs of the people who produce them. And it's given me such a deeper appreciation for spirits. And that's why I think that even for those who don't indulge, the story of Irish whiskey is something that everyone should know. Thank you very much.